Hello and welcome to, I was going to say, a first look exploring session. This is a slightly different exploring session that we're doing today. We're doing a special session looking at the funeral of Queen Mary I. It is not, as is our usual wont, a particularly performative text in the sense that I don't think we have any speeches or any pageantry that we can perform for you. It is mostly the description and list of people who are there and the logistics of it all that we're going to be going into with the readers this session. But this has all been pulled together thanks to Helen Good, who decided the other day to produce a nice transcription for us to read, and we leapt at the opportunity to do so. So this is a rushed through session, though hopefully we ourselves will not rush as we go through it now. So we have reading today, introducing themselves. Liza, introduce yourself to the listeners at home.
Hi, I'm Liza Graham. I'm in London, an actor, singer, and history nerd. Not an amateur history nerd, not a professional actor and singer, amateur nerd. That's the one.
But an increasingly very experienced nerd in those terms. Tom, introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Tom from Brighton.
Eric, introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Eric. I'm not a nerd. Well, I can be a nerd. I just not a professional one. I work in tech support.
Greg, introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Greg. I call myself a history nerd, but this is about 2,000 years too late for me, generally. 1,000 years.
Helen, introduce yourself, please.
Hello, I'm Helen Good. I'm a retired historian, but that just means I don't get paid anymore. I'm mostly working on Star Chamber, but this seemed timely.
And Melita, introduce yourself, please.
Hello, I'm Melita. I'm in South Wales, as it happens, and I'm a PhD candidate at UCL studying the social and political networks of Queen Mary I.
And finally, Johanna, please introduce yourself.
I am Johanna, originally from Canada via Hampshire, now in Essex. I have just finished the main part of a PhD at the University of Winchester on Mary I's legacy from her death in 1558 until just before the Restoration in 1660.
And I'm your host, Robert Crighton. I was going to say, I'll be reading stage directions. No, I won't. I'll just be suggesting who reads what in some approximate order. So we will start off. I will ask Liza if you could read the first unit. It's mostly a list of names. Then Greg, if I could ask you to be number 2. Eric, if you could be number 3. And Tom, you can be number 4. And then we'll pause, I think, and then take stock and see how much text we've actually got through. Okay, take it away.
The funeral of Queen Mary, the interment of the most high, most puissant, and most excellent Princess Mary, the first of that name, late Queen of England, Spain, France, both the Sicilies, Jerusalem, and Ireland, defender of the faith, Archduchess of Austria, Duchess of Burgundy, Milan, and Brabant, Countess of Habsburg, Flanders, and Tyrol, who ordained to her executors and overseers as followeth, that is to say, the names of the executors: the Lord Cardinal Pole, the Archbishop of York, the Marquis of Winchester, the Earl of Arundel, the Earl of Westmoreland, the Earl of Shrewsbury, the Earl of Derby, the Earl of Sussex, the Earl of Pembroke, the Viscount Montague, the Bishop of Ely, the Lord Clinton, the Lord Hastings of Loughborough, Sir William Peter, Sir William Cordell. The names of the to the will: Sir Thomas Cornwallis, Sir Henry Jerningham, Sir Edward Walgrave, Sir Francis Englefield, Sir John Laker, and Master Boxall.
It is to be remembered that the said princess departed out of this transitory life and world on Tuesday in the morning between 5 and 6 of the clock, the 17th day of November in the year of our Lord 1558, and in the 6th year of her Highness's reign at her manor of St. James beyond the Charing Cross. who, after her departure, was perused by the lords of the council and the ladies of the realm, and after opened, cored, and trammelled in this manner. First, her grace's physicians with the surgeons did open her and took out all her bowels with her heart, the which was afterward coffined and buried sumptuously in the chapel, her heart being severally enclosed in a coffer covered with velvet, bound with silver, which was also buried in the said chapel. And after that, the surgeons had done their parts as aforesaid. Then the clerk of the spicery with the officers of the chandlery came and served the said royal course with linen cloth wax with a number of spices very costly, after which the said course was coffined, and then the giant, sorry, I'm going to start again, after the which the said course was coffined, and then the general plumber enclosed the same in lead. The which coffin was covered with purple velvet, and laid on the seams with lace, and nailed with gilt nails. The said noble course, being thus covered and coffined, was brought forth into the privy chamber, and there remained in this order.
The said privy chamber was hanged with black cloth and garnished with scutcheons of arms of her buckram in fine gold of her arms and the king's, in pale within the garter, and some of her own arms within the garter. And in the same chamber stood the corse upon a table with 2 trestles, covered with a pall of rich cloth of gold, and over the said pole was fastened scutcheons of sarcenet in fine gold of her arms within the garter. And there was attendant every day gentlewomen, which did pray about the same with lights burning, and watch every night with dirge and mass every day. And there remained till Saturday the 10th of December, when order was taken for the removing of the said corse from the chapel.
This done, as aforesaid, the Archbishop of York, the Marquis of Winchester, the Earl of Shrewsbury, the Earl of Westmoreland, with others, were appointed to set and take order for the funeral and for the bringing down of the said corse into the chapel, who, having met to do the same, sent for the Garter Principal King of Arms, for to understand the order and what was to be done, who declared unto them in all points the order and what was to be done therein. Then they took order from the furnishings of the foresaid chapel in the manner following.
But we'll come to that in a moment. I think there are a few things that, I don't know, may have surprised a few of the readers, especially when we got to the words opened, cored, and trammelled as a series of points there. But yeah, there are lots of things I was noting that was interesting. Just the number of lands to which Mary is laying claim to, and how actual some of those are or aren't. I'm sure the historians in the room will be able to give us more information on that. But also say what happens to the body and actually how long it's lying there as well. From the 17th to the 10th. And actually, yes, in that case, coring and trammelling is very important if it's going to be lying for such a long time. Thoughts in the room? Wave at me. Who has immediate things that they want to throw in? Greg.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just because of recent events, so much remains so true. But 2 questions really. Only because she was lying there for so long, was there any such thing as a lying in state? It was one of the nutters that queued for hours for that in our current system. Also, what's the difference between an executor and an assistant?
Oh, who wants to field those? Anyone want to leap in? Wave if you wish to leap in. Leap in. Johanna.
I can answer part of that, kind of skirting around the question, as I guess historians do. So one of the really interesting things about medieval and early modern funeral processes is the creation of the effigy. And so the way that we saw with the late queen, when she died, there was the queuing and the kind of walking past the coffin of the average person. That was often done, and I think Melita can correct me if I'm wrong on this, that it was done more as a procession through the city as opposed to people trucking past the body kind of trucked past the people. And so this creation of a funeral effigy is so important because it's one of those moments where a lot of people will see the monarch potentially for the only time and certainly for the last time. And so in that moment, there is that sense of finality and closure that a lion in state brings, but not necessarily the same procedure as we will have seen in 2022. And I guess I realize I have said funeral effigy and I've said that as if everyone knows what I'm talking about.
Yeah, too soon. We'll come to that.
Yeah, okay, I'll save this then.
Save the effigy for later. Helen.
Yeah, the thing that I've done with this is I've looked at what isn't happening. And the big thing that really isn't there is the Duke of Norfolk. Because although he was barely of age, in fact, I think he possibly was a few months short of being 21, he had been created Earl Marshal. And he is credited in a number of books with having run the funeral. But perfectly obviously from this, he didn't. Her own people who'd been with her forever sent for Garter, who told them what needed to be done. And the Earl Marshal doesn't appear at all, which is a little strange for a royal funeral.
Anyone on the various titles of Mary? Because we've got an awful lot there. Melita.
Yes, I can help with that one. As Queen Regnant of England, she was Queen of England, and at that time England was still claiming to be entitled to the crown of France and Ireland. All of the other titles she held as consort to King Philip of Spain, who was king of those other countries, and Archduke of Austria and all the rest of it. So yes, probably France was the most unrealistic of all of those titles, of course.
Yes,
Jerusalem. Jerusalem was
yes,
a bit...
well, but the kingdom, it was Jerusalem and the two Sicilies, so they were together conceptually. Obviously, there was, as you say, no actual control.
Well, having taken out her heart, did anyone find whether Calais was written across it or not?
I was thinking the same thing.
I mean, they had the opportunity to check, and so I'm being a bit grim there. Okay, but yeah, I mean, the process as described, is written about in a reasonable amount of detail, and which I really was not expecting at all. I mean, but yeah, the body is treated in various ways. Clerk of the Spicery.
Very costly.
Any other thoughts on this little section before we move on? Liza.
Yeah, I'm finding it interesting. First of all, that, I mean, in the I guess post-Victorian, we're used to having people speak of the deceased as a body, but no, they're saying, they're saying she was opened, her heart was taken out. So it's not the body as an it, it's still her as a person, which feels kind of weird, but I'm rolling with it. Anyway, so the other thing is that when the body, if I'm reading this right, when the body is lying in the privy chamber from the time when she's coffined until the 10th of December, and she dies on the 17th of November, so that's quite a while. And it's being guarded by gentlewomen. It's not being guarded by men or by soldiers or by as the late queen was. She's being guarded by she's being attended, as it were, by gentlewomen, which did pray around the coffin with lights, with candles burning, and watch every night. They stayed awake every night with dirge and mass every day. So the religious observances are being done in the privy chamber as though it's a chapel, right? But there's no mention of men guarding her. It's just women, which is kind of interesting as a point.
Johanna, did you have a...
Yeah, to kind of bring back the kind of the body versus she, there's a really interesting divide between kind of modern, Victorian to modern interpretations of death and the early modern here, in that even though Mary obviously is dead, her body is still treated as a queen because she is still the only anointed monarch in the realm. And so she continues to have that power, even though she's not alive to use it, she's still the queen. So the same way that we would have seen in 2022, when you curtsied or bowed, some people chose to, at the coffin of Elizabeth II, that same reverence would have been shown to Mary, even though she's a body, which I think this just really shows that differentiation, that it isn't the body, it is still the anointed monarch. Even though Elizabeth has presumably been proclaimed, Mary still holds that sacred power.
Yes, also the dead always take precedence. Every situation that you can think of, if you're dead, you take precedence over everybody else.
Oh, yes, Melita.
I'll just comment on the point that Liza made about the military aspect. There wasn't the same association between the monarchy and the military at all in this period. That was very much a Victorian, Edwardian concept from really the 20th century. The monarch almost had nothing to do with the military in any kind of everyday sense. There would have been male bodyguards, or not male, but the yeomen of the guard and so forth would have been watching and waiting outside the privy chamber, I expect. But in the same way that Mary, in her innermost chamber in life, was attended by women because it was more personal space, then it's still the women who are guarding her at this stage.
Okay, we're going to move on. So if I could ask, hold on to your thoughts if you've got them for later. Johanna, could I ask you to read section 5? Melita, could you read section 6? And then Greg 7 and Liza 8. And then we'll pause again.
So the manner of the furniture of the chapel at St. James. It was hanged with black cloth and garnished with escutcheons in metal. The high altar was trimmed with purple velvet, and in the dean's place was hanged a canopy of purple velvet. And in the midst of the said chapel there was made a hearse foursquare of 46 great tapers, the which did weigh 200 hundredweight the piece, being wrought with crowns and roses of the same. And beneath the same tapers a valance of sarcenet, with the queen's word written with letters of gold, and a fringe of gold about the same valance, and within that valance another valance of gross grain, with a fringe of black silk. The said hearse was richly set with pencils and scutcheons of arms in metal. There was under the said hearse a majesty of taffeta, with a dome gilded, and 4 evangelists in the 4 corners of the said majesty. The 6 posts were covered with black velvet, and on every post a scutcheon of sarcenet in fine gold. The rail of the said hearse within was hanged with broadcloth, and the ground within both rails covered with black. Also the utter side of the stalls, which was instead of the rails on each side, was hanged with black. At each end there was made a rail overthwart the said chapel, which was also hanged with black, and garnished with scutcheons. Within the rail stood 15 stools, covered with fine broadcloth, and on the same 15 cushions of purple velvet, and under the foot to kneel on 15 cushions of black cloth. At the upper end of the hearse, without the rail, there was made an altar, which stood on the left hand of the choir, covered with purple velvet, which was richly garnished with ornaments of the church. Which chapel being thus furnished, order was given to the sergeant of the vestry for the safekeeping of the same, till such time as the royal course was brought down into the said chapel.
The bringing down of the course into the chapel at St. James. All things in a readiness as aforesaid. On Saturday, the 10th day of December, the course was brought down in this manner. Warning given to all manner of estates having black to give their attendance the said day at dirge. And about 3 of the clock, when all things were ready, the great chamber with the stairs and the court to the chapel door was hanged with black and garnished with the scutcheons. Then the lords and ladies assembled together in the chamber of presence and great chamber, whereas all the officers of the house stood with torches with divers of the guards. Then the Bishop of Worcester, the Bishop of Chester, the Bishop of Coventry and Lichfield, and the Bishop of Exeter, with the Queen's chapel, went up to fetch the said course. And the chapel stood in the great chamber. And the bishops went into the chamber of presence and censed the course and said divers prayers. And after, the said course was taken up by 8 gentlemen, and all the others set in order. That is to say, first the cross, and on each side a white branch, then the chapel, then all the gentlemen and squires, the chaplains of most dignity, and on each side went the foresaid officers with torches and the said guard. Also then all knights, and after them councillors, then barons and bishops not in pontificalibus, then the kings of arms, then the course covered with a rich pall of cloth of tissue. And on each side of the course 2 noblemen, that is to say the Marquis of Winchester, the Earl of Westmoreland, the Earl of Shrewsbury, and the Earl of Derby, which touched the course with their hands. Over the said course was borne a canopy of purple velvet, with 6 blue staves with gilt knobs, borne by 6 squires, Master Garrett, Roger Manners, Leonard West, John Arundel, William Forster, and William Babington.
Then the chief mourner, the Countess of Lennox, assisted by the Earl of Huntingdon and the Viscount Montague, her train borne by the Lady Catherine Hastings, assisted by the Vice-Chamberlain, then the other mourners 2 and 2, that is to say the Countess of Oxford, the Countess of Worcester, the Countess of Huntingdon, the Countess of Bedford, the Viscountess of Montague, the Lady Clinton, the Lady Morley, the Lady Dacres of the South, the Lady Latimer, the Lady Staunton, the Lady Lumley, the Lady Windsor, the Lady Brock, the Lady North, and after them other ladies and gentlewomen, and after them followed the guard. And in this order went into the chapel, where the course was placed within the hearse, and the mourners on each side 7, and at the end, at the head, the chief mourner kneeling at the stools with cushions that are before named. Then the assistants with the executors and all the other lords were placed. Then the beads were bidden by Norrie, King of Arms.
Then the dirge began, sung by the chaplains, executed by the Bishop of Worcester. And there was also dirge said at the little altar before mentioned. The lessons were read by the chiefest of the chaplains, and the last by 3 bishops, that is to say, the 7th by the Bishop of Exeter, the 8th by the Bishop of Chester, 9th by the Bishop of Worcester. And the said Bishop of Exeter censed the course, being in pontificabilis. The bishops at the reading of the said lessons had copes and mitres, but none had croziers. But the Bishop of Worcester, which did none had croziers, but the Bishop of Worcester, which did execute, and the Bishop of Exeter, when he did assist him in doing the same. The dirge done, the mourners went up again in order, the chiefest first, where they had a great supper.
Always important to have a great supper after what looks to have been a very long day. Lots of names being thrown at us again, lots of details of textiles, materials, lots of things to throw about. I mean, the only name that's going to leap out to our listeners, of course, is Lady Lumley, who we've looked at her translation of Iphigenia. But I'm sure possibly the least important, I'm sure, is some of the other names that might be available here. So yeah, anything of that people want to leap in on? Say a lot of candles, a lot of material stuff. Helen.
There's a guy, I think it's Ian Archer, but somebody has written quite extensively on the impact of royal funerals on the London cloth trade. I've been into, I had a quick look in the garderobe, the Great Wardrobe accounts, and the Great Wardrobe reckons the total of the funerals, I mean, not only here, but also Westminster Abbey, was £7,662 and of some shillings. So we're talking major expense. And effectively what they're saying is anyone who got a decent black outfit could take part, because it was very expensive, was black dye. Black dyed cloth.
Yes. Melita and then Johanna.
I was going to say, in a sense, that's similar to the lying in state that we've just seen, in that members of the public, provided they could look decent and respectable, could go and see the body.
Johanna.
I was just going to add on kind of the full breaking down of the cost. At one point, it is sadly very damaged at the moment, but the British Library has two of the main kind of Elizabeth ordering people to be paid for Mary's funeral. And at one point she's ordering £2,662 and 9 shillings to be given to Edward Waldegrave for his contributions. So he's gone out of pocket and is being reimbursed. And then the Great Wardrobe is given part of £3,000 to cover all of this, which Helen has noted. And I think the interesting thing in that is that, as you said, like the overall cost is a lot. When the average noble funeral would have been about £3,000. So originally Elizabeth I had ordered, or had it ordered, that originally she only wanted £3,000 spent, which I guess we know now, nothing ever goes according to budget. But she had originally wanted kind of a very minimal expenditure on this funeral. And so the fact that it went almost just over double what a noble funeral was is really interesting, that even though Elizabeth I's regime was perhaps trying to limit this remembrance and this public remembrance, it still is a moment where you have to give a queen her due, regardless of how you feel about her, which I think is always a fascinating aspect to this.
Elizabeth I trying not to spend money, never ever thought it. Helen.
Yes, word on Lady Lennox, the Countess of Lennox. She was Elizabeth and Mary's first cousin. She was the daughter of Henry VIII's sister Margaret by a second marriage. She, if anybody, apart from Lady Catherine Grey, if anybody was a threat to Elizabeth, she was. And she had been part of Mary's household, and she'd been a friend of hers from childhood. So, but she and her husband were spending a fair amount of time when they weren't at the funeral rites in being very, very nice to Elizabeth and saying what a wonderful queen she'd make. So, you know, she wasn't fomenting rebellion. She just hoped not to have to spend the rest of her life in the Tower.
Liza, then Eric.
About the Countess of Lennox, I was wondering why Elizabeth wasn't chief mourner, apart from that Mary had obviously put her in prison. But why is the deceased sister not chief mourner?
I'll go to Melita, then back to Eric.
Because up until the events of last week, monarchs did not attend funerals.
It kind of upstages the dead monarch, I guess.
Eric.
Yeah, I was gonna, well, not ask, but I mean, there was a part of me going, yeah, this is, you know, lovely, and sort of the description is great, but then there's a part of me going, yeah, the transition of power is not going to be easy. Whereas, as we saw in the recent funeral of Queen Elizabeth II, like sort of King Charles was proclaimed king before. Sorry, King Philip, not King Charles. Why am I thinking? I'm still trapped in, the 1600s with Helen, apparently. Like the transition of power is not as smooth was not as smooth back then as it is now.
No, and the proclaiming of the new monarch and making sure all of those nuts and bolts are in many ways a lot more important. In fact, if you're very lucky, I'll proclaim the new queen at the end of the session. But I'm interested in the logistics because I'm always into the stage management of these things. They've had the better part of a month to get ready, and they've been told by they've been told the order and what's supposed to be done, but you've got an awful lot of people who have to go in a certain order, who are carrying things. One of those things is the late queen, and they've got to go. You've got dirges to be sung, and services to be held, all of which has to be arranged, organised, and queued. I'm always really interested, and particularly interested in the modern funerals. It's just like, how do you queue these things? How do you queue so many people, and know that these things? And it's a question of, the modern funeral that we've seen has been rehearsed for years on some level, not entirely. But how much preparation prior to the act? Because surely it's treason to rehearse this kind of stuff before the monarch's actually dead. So it's a really interesting question. When they were talking about they went to such and such who told them how everything was to be done, and it's like, is it just because it was the one who remembered last time? I mean, it's not been that long since Edward passed.
Or Henry. I mean, their funerals are coming up every 6 years.
You almost.
So this is.
Sorry, go.
Sorry, this is a Catholic funeral, which I think would be a lot more familiar to many people, though it is a monarch, so obviously has a different level. But I think, like in retrospect, we see Mary as the outlier, as a Catholic post-Reformation monarch. But really, if we're looking at this from 1558, Edward VI funeral is the outlier as a Protestant service, which Mary allows him to have a Protestant one when she goes in private and does a Requiem Mass for his soul. So I would assume this would be very familiar to a lot of the clergy, that the rite and ritual is the same.
Yeah, I suppose when Elizabeth goes, that's going to be the real question of anyone remember how we do this. Because it's been such a long time. Melita, and then Eric, then we'll move on.
I was just going to say that a lot of the people who are mentioned, that they will know what order of precedence they have, because that is how they will have moved around the court all the time. So they're always going to know, the person who ranks slightly above them and the person who ranks slightly behind them. So falling into place shouldn't be too difficult for them.
And Eric.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that, but also I was going to ask about obviously, because you mentioned religion in this, and I hadn't thought of that because obviously here where I live it's Greek Orthodox or that kind of thing. So it's I was just fascinated by the fact that some of the bishops had copes and mitres, but none had crosiers except the ones who were executing. So it's kind of like the sort of symbols of power in the church were actually sort of given to the people who were executing specific duties rather than just sort of symbolizing things.
Yes. Excellent. Right, we will read on. We're next. The Manner of the Watch, isn't it? It's 9 next, isn't it? Just as I get confused. Eric, if you could read 9. Tom, if you can read 10. Greg, if you could read 11. Johanna, if you could read 12. Melita, read 13. And then we will pause a bit.
The Manner of the Watch. After supper, there was a song. Watch both of the lords made of a watch made up both of lords, ladies, and gentlemen, which ladies sat within the rails of the hearse. Also there did watch a herald and a pursuivant every night, which had their allowance in the court of meat, fire, and all other things according to the order of the court. Also there did watch certain of the guard with other of her servants, which did hold torches every night. About 10 of the clock, service began, which was said by one of the Queen's chaplains, and so continued in prayers all night till the morning, when they were relieved with ladies. And when they were so relieved, they had their breakfast served according to their degrees. Then began the Mass of Our Lady, executed by the Bishop of Chester, the Lady Latimer chief mourner, and that done, the Mass of the Holy Ghost, executed by the Bishop of Exeter, the Viscountess Montague chief mourner.
The processing to the Mass of Requiem on Sunday. On Sunday, about 9 of the clock, the said noblemen and lady mourners, which were at the dirge the night before, came forth of the great chamber in order as this manner. First all gentlemen, squires and knights, then the officers of arms, then barons, then bishops, then viscountess and the overseers, then the executors, and then the garter, then the chief mourner, the Countess of Lennox, with the rest following as at the dirge the night before, and so proceeded into the chapel, where they were placed as before. The Norre King of Arms bade prayer. Then the choir began the Mass of Requiem. The said Mass was executed by the Bishop of Worcester and the Bishop of Exeter, and the Bishop of Chester assistants, and the Pistoler and the Gospeler, with deacon and subdeacons besides their assistants in copse.
Then the Mass proceeded till the offering, at the which offerings, when the bishops turned them, the mourners turned them. The mourners stood up, and the chief mourner came forth, having certain noblemen and the officers of arms before her, the rest of the mourners following. Her train borne, went to the altar, where there was laid by a gentleman usher a carpet and a cushion, on the which she kneeled, and having her offering delivered unto her, offered, and then rose up and returned to the hearse again. After her obeisance made to the course, and having but one officer of arms before her, without her train borne, offered for herself and returned. Then offered the 2 noblemen assistants, then the other mourners 2 and 2, then the other lords. The offering done, the Mass proceeded out to the end. The Mass done, they departed from the chapel in the same sort as they came thither, up into the chamber of presence, where they had a great dinner, and all other officers there giving their attendance had great fare in like manner. The dinner done, they departed to their chamber for a season, and reposed themselves till 3 of the clock.
Then they all assembled in the chamber of presence, and when they were all met, then they went to the dirge in the said order as they went to the Mass of Requiem. And the said dirge was executed by the Bishop of Coventry and Lichfield. At Magnificat, the corpse was censed by the said bishop and the Bishop of Exeter. The 7th lesson was read by the Bishop of Carlisle, the 8th by the Bishop of Exeter, the 9th by the Bishop of Coventry and Lichfield. The which bishops, when they read the lessons, had copes on their backs and mitres on their heads, and they that censed had their crosses borne before them. The dirge done, they departed from the chapel to the chamber of presence, where they had a great supper, and after supper the watch was charged, and service said, as on Saturday, at night in all points.
The manner of the usage of the ceremonies on Monday. On Monday in the morning, the watch was revived, as before on Sunday morning, and after the reviving, the Bishop of Chester began the Mass of the Holy Ghost. That done, the Bishop of Carlisle began the Mass of Our Lady. At the offering of these 2 masses, the chief mourner offered, and no more. The 2 masses done, the said mourners departed, and the great estates, mourners, came down as on Sunday to the Mass of Requiem, and there offered, and used themselves as they did at the foresaid Mass on Sunday, which Mass was executed by the Bishop of Coventry and Lichfield. And after Mass returned to dinner, and after dinner, about 3 of the clock, then went to the dirge, as before on Sunday, the which was executed by the Bishop of Winchester, the 7th lesson read by the Bishop of Worcester, the 8th by the Bishop of Exeter, the ninth by the Bishop of Winchester, aforesaid. The corpse sentenced by the Bishops of Winchester and Worcester. The dirge done, they went to supper, and after supper the watch was charged as the night before in all points.
I mean, yes, we've got to the point where we start having a lot of masses. I mean, I don't know how many lessons you want to sit through, but when you get there's how many masses you want to go through, there's a lot of listing of bishops going on here, and yes, the constant referring also a great supper after it's a hard day's work. This actually just being present, you know, this.
Post themselves till 3 o'clock after the great dinner.
Say again?
After the great dinner, they went and reposed themselves till 3 o'clock, which I rather like.
Yeah, seems perfectly reasonable to me.
Yeah.
Thoughts on the room, Eric?
I was going to say this is interesting because it's kind of over several days, whereas I mean, okay, maybe I can't remember how long like the morning was for Queen Elizabeth II, but like it feels like that one was a lot quicker compared to this, where you had like masses every day and stuff. I don't know, maybe that's just me, sort of, you know, the whole dinner, supper, then dinner, then mass, then supper, and that kind of thing. I mean, there wasn't like, yeah, I seem to remember like the actual funeral ceremony, like the rites and stuff. Here, I mean, here, as in like watching it on TV was like live streamed for, I don't know, 9-10 hours, however long it was. But like before that, there was also a ceremony separately in Scotland, and you know, like sort of, yeah, I don't know. It's just fascinating, sort of how brief it is compared to this.
Well, no, it lasts. I mean, yes, you haven't got the month's preparation work beforehand, but what you have got with the one we've just had is it took an awful lot of time. There were an awful lot of things to be got through, including the lying in state, which was 3 days, I think.
I mean, it's 10 days. You know, 10-day mourning period we had for the death of Queen Elizabeth. With this, I mean, the question here for me is how many people are actually in the room for these ceremonies? These aren't big public events, are they? I mean, you know, the people listed here are the people there, pretty much. Or am I wrong? It's not public ceremonial in the same way. Go to Melita, then Helen.
I think if you look, it says the ladies and the mourners. So you've got the named people, then you've got another clutch of people who would have been the rest of Mary's household, but it wasn't, and possibly the wives and daughters of some of the men who are mentioned and the husbands and what have you of the senior women, but it wasn't open to the public in a general sense. But I would guess that there might have been dozens of people in each room, in each mass.
Because I mean, that's the difference. Because what we normally do on our sessions, we're looking at theatrical, performative things that you know have a mass audience, civic pageantry, royal entries, and similar. And the reason why it never really occurred to me to do funerals was because they're not. These are not public events in the same way, because it's all about, for the public, the new monarch. Lingering on the old monarch is not good politics. Helen, and then lots of other people fly.
Yeah, Melita said what I was going to.
Excellent. Tom?
This all happened in November, which is worth thinking about. I mean, night vigils through in a chapel in November.
We're into December now. It's early.
Yeah. Same.
Even worse.
And it sounds exhausting if it's the same, forgive me, players who were in attendance.
Yeah, Helen.
I think there's some evidence of shifts because at one point, for certain masses, you've got other people acting as chief mourner. It isn't always the Countess of Lennox. So I imagine there was a shift system in operation, certainly through the night.
And this is the difference between, you know, performance and ritual. This is a there is a performative element to this, but this is a ritualistic action. It doesn't have an audience in the same way. The participants are all part of the ritual, even if they're not actively doing anything. Melita.
I suppose that's in a way the difference between a performance for the audience and a performance for Mary herself. This was all about Mary's soul. And in a sense, it doesn't matter if anybody else saw it, as long as the priests were there praying for her.
Okay, we will move on to Tuesday. We've just had Monday. And so, Eric, could you read 14? Liza, I'm so sorry, if you could read 15. Tom, 16. The first bit of 16. Greg, can you read the chariot with the corpse? Melita, if you could read 17. And then Johanna, if you could read 18, and then I think that's a reasonable old chunk for us to get through.
The manner of the usage of the ceremony on Tuesday. On Tuesday, the Mass of the Holy Ghost was said by the Bishop of Exeter with his assistants, the Mass of Our Lady by the Bishop of Worcester with his assistants, the Mass of Requiem by the Bishop of Winchester, the two aforesaid bishops, Pistoler and Gospeler, with deacon and subdeacon, and there again assistants in copes. To the which masses came the foresaid noble ladies, mourners, as they did the day before, and offered in the same manner, and after mass to dinner. When dinner was done, the heralds gave order to all sorts of people having blacks to give their attendance, and to keep their places as they were by them set in order. During the which time of their setting in order, the corpse was brought forth and set into the chancel, and the pole laid over the same, and high on the said pole lay the presentation. In the mean season, the lords and ladies made them ready, and when they were ready, they proceeded to the Abbey of Westminster in this order following.
The order of proceeding to the Abbey of Westminster. First, 2 porters with black staves, then the sergeant of the vestry afoot, and with him the sergeant porter on horseback. Then the cross with 2 great white branches on each side, one borne by 2 men the cross with 2 great white branches on each side, one borne by 2 men in surplices. Then the gentlemen of the Queen's Chapel in their surplices singing. Then the monks of Westminster, which met the cross at the gate in King Street. Then the Lord Abbot of Westminster. Then 2 sergeants of arms with their maces. Then the standard of the dragon, borne by Mr. Henry Pole, his horse trapped to the pastern with 4 scutcheons of arms in metal and buckram, and a chafron in his forehead, and in a long gown, his hood on his head. Then gentlemen in long gowns, their hoods over their shoulder. Then the officers of the house in like manner. Then ambassadors, servants, and strangers. Then the trumpets. Then the chaplains without dignity. Then 2 sergeants of arms with their maces. Then the standard of the greyhound, borne by Sir Oliver Lawrence, his horse trapped and garnished as above. Then knights, then bannerets, then officers of the household, being knights, then chaplains of dignity, then 2 sergeants of arms with their maces, then the standard of the lion, borne by Sir George Howard, his horse trapped and garnished as the other before. Then barons, then bishops, then viscounts, then the assessor and comptroller of the household, then earls, then the Archbishop of York, with the ambassador Count de Ferio. Then the overseers to the will, then the executors, then the 2 sergeants of arms with their maces. Then the embroidered banner, borne by the Viscount Hereford, his horse trapped and garnished as the other before mentioned. Then the helm and crest borne by Chester Herald, his horse trapped to the pasterns with 4 scutcheons and a chafron, in a long gown, his hood on his head. Then the target borne by Norroy, King of Arms, in the same manner as Chester before. Then the sword borne by Clarenceau, King of Arms, his horse trapped and garnished as before. Then the coat of arms borne by Garter, Principal, King of Arms, his horse trapped and garnished as before. Then the Lord Chamberlain of Household.
Then followed the chariot drawn with 5 horses, which were trapped and with black velvet on every horse, 4 scutcheons of arms, and a chafron on the forehead. And on every horse a page of honour, in a long gown, his hood on his head, and a banner in his hand, of several arms, and on each side of the said horses, from the fore-horse to the chariot, there rode 5 gentlemen on horseback, with their horses trapped and garnished with scutcheons and aforesaid, which bear great banners of damask of the Queen's descent painted in fine gold.
The chariot with the corpse. The chariot covered with rich cloth of tissue, black with a fringe of gold, and within the same a majesty of taffeta with a dome of 4 evangelists, and at each corner a banner of arms and of damask. The corse laid in the bottom of the same, and on the corse a pall of rich taffeta, with a cross of white tissue. And over the same was laid the presentation, apparelled in robes of estate, with a crown over her head, the ball and sceptre in her hands, her fingers being richly set with rings, and in the same rich stones, the sceptre and crown garnished in like manner. At the head and the foot a gentleman usher kneeling, escorting the chariot with the corse on the left hand. First the banner of Mary Magdalene borne by Lancaster herald. Then the Earl of Shrewsbury, assistant, touched the corse. Then the Marquis of Winchester, assistant, touching the corse. Then the banner of Our Lady borne by Somerset herald, escorting the same chariot on the right hand. First the banner of St. George borne by York herald. Then the Earl of Derby, assistant, touching the corse. Then the Earl of Westmoreland, assistant, touching the corse. Then the banner of the Trinity, borne by Windsor herald.
Oh, you're muted at the moment.
Then the chief mourner, the Countess of Lennox, her horse trapped with velvet. On her left, the Earl of Huntingdon, and on her right, the Viscount Montague, assistants to the chief mourner. And Sir Henry Jerningham, master of the horse, leading the horse of estate, aside of the chief mourner. Then the Countess of Oxford, the Countess of Worcester, the Countess of Huntingdon, the Countess of Bedford. These 4 followed on horseback, their horses trapped to the pasterns and led by one in a black coat. Then the first chariot covered with black velvet and garnished with scutcheons of sarcenet in fine gold, drawn with 4 horses trapped with black cloth down to the pastern, with 4 pages riding on the same horses with gowns and hoods, and in the same these ladies in mourning apparel, according to their estates, viz., mantles and the barbs above their chins. The Viscountess Montague, the Lady Clinton, the Lady Morley, the Lady Darcy of the South. Then followed these ladies on horseback, their horses trapped to the pastern with black cloth and led by one in a black coat, the Lady Latimer, the Lady Staunton, the Lady Lumley, the Lady Windsor.
Then the second chariot, apparelled as the first with 4 horses and 4 pages on the same, and in the same these ladies in mourning apparel according to their estate, viz. Mantles and the barbs above their chins, the Lady Broch, the Lady North, the Lady Anne Grey, the Lady Huntington's daughter. Then followed these ladies on horseback, their horses trapped to the pastern with black cloth, and led by one in a black coat. They in mourning apparel according to their estate, that is to say, a mantle with a small train, and their barbs on their chin. The Lady Cornwallis, the Lady Jerningham, the Lady Peter, Mistress Dormer. Then the third chariot, apparelled as the former, with 4 horses and 4 pages on the same, and therein these that follow in mourning apparel according to their degree, a gown without a train, and their barbs under their chins. Mistress Clarentius, Mistress Penn, Mistress Times, Mistress Southwell. Then all gentlewomen, waiters, and chamberers on horseback in a black. Then the vice-chamberlain and the master of the henchmen. Then the guard with torches. Then all noblemen's servants in order, having black coats. And in this order they proceeded to the west door of the abbey, and on either side pursuivants of arms to see the proceedings kept.
And so we have, yes, a lot of people processing, a lot of horses. banners, lots of detail of all that. I do like the standard of the dragon, born by Mr. Henry Pole, his horse. For some reason that just leapt out of me. Not because of the dragon, just because it's just Mr. Henry Pole, his horse. It's like, you know, I just like, you know, it's his horse, nobody else's horse. And again, we've got that reference I think Helen made earlier. You know, all sorts of people having blacks to give their attendance. You know, if you've got the garb, you can come. That is fine. Thoughts in the room. Lots and lots of, I say, names and things. It's repetitious, but there's so many avenues you could actually go down. Johanna.
Unless Helen has a burning thing to say.
No, I was about to say now is the time for the presentation.
So I missed that.
The effigy. The effigy.
I get excited about. This is my moment. I absolutely love the effigy. I think this is the coolest moment. Because like the respect given to the effigy is the same that you would give to the monarch themselves. And so I think that is just such an incredibly powerful symbol of the ritual and sacred nature of monarchy in England at this point, that this is all still held in Mary's body via this effigy. And so this is a life-size wooden, essentially replica of Mary, and you can go to Westminster Abbey now and see it. But I think the most fascinating part of it for me, and what catches my breath every time I see it, is that if you look at it, it's not clothed anymore, which kind of freaks people out the first time if they're unprepared for that. But if you look at her stomach, you can see that it has this little bump, and it's almost like a little baby bump, which of course in the months before her death, she had thought that she was pregnant again, or her doctors thought she was pregnant again. And so obviously in hindsight, we know she wasn't, but it's amazing being able to see the effigy and to see that she has this kind of expanding of her abdomen, and kind of to a world without ultrasounds and x-rays and CAT scans and all of that. It's absolutely incredible to be able to see Mary as she would have been seen at the time. And I think the most fascinating thing on top of that is also just this kind of notion that this is meant to be seen from afar. It's not meant to be seen close up. It is meant to be kind of you will look from far away at your monarch. And so it's just this perfect moment of seeing Mary as her subjects would have seen her, kind of far away, but equally monarchical in this perspective. And I will stop talking, but I'm very excited about effigies.
No, absolutely. If you have more, do continue. Unless other people have other thoughts that they want to leap on. I say we've got all the same sort of names turning around. There's an awful lot of touching the course. I'm quite interested in the logistics of that. What bit are you touching? How are you touching it? How many people along the side can touch the course? How does that work? I don't know. Liza. That wasn't a question for you to answer. You waved earlier.
I thought she was in her lead coffin at this point. So when they say touching the course, do they mean with their hands on the coffin, which is the lead coffin that's covered with all the nice fabric? Is that
but
what
how
they're
close
touching?
do you get to it? I mean, this is the thing. Are they just touching the structure? Or, how does that work? And I say, how many people get to touch that on the way around? Johanna.
I would assume, and this is a logical guess based on historical knowledge and then the last 2 weeks, I would assume it would be similar on when they were carrying Elizabeth II's coffin and there were the 8 doing the actual lifting, and then the guy at the back just like, yep, I'm helping, I'm touching it, it's all fine, I got it, doing absolutely nothing if that coffin started to slide backwards. And I feel like that is what they would be doing, that they're not carrying, but they are symbolically touching it. But if one of the pallbearers kind of gave out, or if something breaks and it collapses, they're not about to catch her. I think it's more symbolic than, I don't want to say useful, but it's more symbolic than tangible. Yes, practical.
Greg.
I think, maybe I misunderstood the way you said it, Rob, but I think it was the assistants to the will that were touching it, because it said assistant. It confused me the first time I said it, because I thought the word assistant seemed out of place. But
I think in that context, each of these great lords, the Marquis of Winchester and the Earl of Shrewsbury, have little alter egos, their assistants, who are doing stuff for them, is how I. So I don't think it's actually the Marquis of Winchester and the Earl of Shrewsbury who are doing, as Johanna said, and sort of touching it. I think it's their representatives, but I don't know. But that would be my reading of it.
Liza, you were waving earlier before I sort of, because I didn't mean to actually aim that question at you, because earlier, did you actually have something you wanted to add? A point.
I did, but I've forgotten what it was.
Excellent. That's my job here is done. Other thoughts, Eric?
I mean, okay, obviously we've talked about all the named people in this, but then it's just like, it tells you kind of just reading through what Liza was reading, just like, what was it? Section 15, basically, people who are following, the whole train of people following this sort of procession or participating in the procession or whatever. Like, that's just a lot of people employed in this one goal. And that's just, I mean, okay, not all of them were in the house, were part of the household, but I mean, that's a lot of people.
And the order of the people moving out there, I mean, again, it's all very ordered, and it's starting with the lowest, and it gets highest until you get to the highest of all, and that's the way it works. How many people do you think are actually viewing this? Because it's a public area, a public place. Do we know? Are there any records as to how many people are there? I don't know. Helen.
I think that it was probably fairly competitive among the lords who were present. Getting as many of their servants into black as possible. So it's a sign of your richness if you manage to fit out a couple of hundred of your henchmen in black. So that may very well have been a competitive matter, and of course they had to be kept in some sort of order.
Melita and then Eric.
This is going from St James's Palace to Westminster Abbey, so we can assume, I think, that there were people in the streets lining the route. So I don't know what route you would take, or what route you'd have taken then before the Thames was embanked, but it's quite a long way. I mean, it'd be quite it's a mile or two.
They
I
said
think.
Going along King Street, so I was just checking a map. I don't think it's an excessively long journey. I mean, it's not a short hop by any stretch of the imagination, but it's not too long.
Not nice in December, though.
Oh no!
At least they're in carriages, essentially, but not. I wouldn't want to do it.
But yeah. I mean, they're used to Lord Mayor shows in October, so it's only been it's only been a little over a month since they're all expected to stand outside in the moderate cold. So yeah. Do we know what the weather was like? I assume it didn't rain.
I'd assume it did rain. It was a particularly wet and miserable couple of years. There was famine, and it was a hard time. So I think it was very, very high likelihood the weather was poor.
They were also in the middle of a flu pandemic.
Yeah.
Which
it is peak 2022, but in 1558.
Yeah, but I mean, that's why Cardinal Pole isn't there. The Archbishop of Canterbury, you would have expected him to be there, because he'd succumbed to the pandemic.
Okay, well, let us. Oh, sorry, Eric, and then we'll move on.
I was just wondering because, like, I mean, obviously we've talked about like sort of the purple velvet and black velvet and all that stuff and all black silks and that kind of thing. I'm just wondering, like, obviously this might be more of a sort of textiles question, but what was the black material made of? Because I mean, like clothing in terms of like you would use black dye, right? I mean, you wouldn't just, yeah. So what would it be dyed with? I'm guessing this was very expensive and very lucrative if you were selling this kind of dye at this particular point in time.
Anyone want to leap in on dyes?
I can only leap in a bit on cloth. When it says cloth, it generally will mean some kind of wool. Obviously, I didn't have cotton. Might possibly be linen, but generally it'd be some sort of cloth, woolen substance.
Liza.
Yeah, I sew and I call costumes which aren't necessarily accurate, but I've read up a bit. Again, amateur nerd. But people's outer garments were usually wool, unless you were of very high status, in which case you might wear silk. And then there's some people who are in buckram, and leather can also be dyed black. The buckram is basically like suede. Usually it's sort of tea with milk colored stuff, and officers wear jerkins made out of it. But as with most leather, if you're a high status officer, you can have a high status buckram coat. And there's tons of words here for different kinds of silk. There's, tissue, taffeta, damask, grosgrain. Tissue is metallic, right? Tissue is cloth of gold. And I'm wondering what the velvet is. Is the velvet going to be silk velvet? Or is the nap of it going to be linen or cotton with a silk pile? Who knows?
No cotton.
Cotton.
They didn't have cotton. It would be silk velvet.
They haven't discovered that you can do that yet in the southern states.
They do have cotton, but it isn't cotton as we know it. So they have a fabric, a very thin wool, which is called cotton, because we're going to come across it.
Neat.
But it isn't.
Okay. Well, we are getting to now the abbey itself. We've made that journey. And so, Liza, if you can start us off with 19, Melita, if you could do 20, Greg 21, Tom 22, Eric 23, and 24, and because, and Johanna, if you could do 25. Okay, let's see what happens in the manner of the furnishing of the abbey and the manner of the hearse.
The body of the church from the west door to the choir door was hanged with black cloth and garnished with scutcheons. Also the choir was hanged within the stalls with black and garnished with scutcheons of paper in metal. And between the steps going up to the altar and the choir door, there was made a very sumptuous hearse of 8 square with 9 principals, double-storied, having in lights to the number of 1,000 and more, garnished with 36 dozen pensnels of sarsenet, that an L being a unit of length.
No, I think these are banners, pencils.
Okay, 36 dozen pensnels of sarsenet. Between the gold and silver of the Queen's badges, the 8 parchments hanged double with valance of sarsenet, written with letters of gold and fringed with silk fringe. On the same hearse, many scutcheons in metal with many small scutcheons of wax. On the upper part of the 8 great posts stood 8 archangels of wax, and under them 8 great scutcheons of arms within the garter of wax. All the 8 square of the hearse was garnished and set with angels, mourners, and queens in their robes of estate, made of wax. Under the hearse was a great majesty of taffeta lined with coffering. And in the same was made a great dome of painter's work with 4 evangelists of fine gold. About the said hearse, about and under the said great scutcheons, went a valance of taffeta, a quarter of a yard deep, written with letters of gold, Dieu est mon droit, and arms in the same manner, to stand in the midst of every square, having a fringe of gold a quarter deep, and within that a valance of black taffeta with a fringe of black silk quarter deep. The 8 posts were covered with black velvet, and on every post a scutcheon of sarcenet wrought with fine gold.
The rail of the same was hanged on both sides with fine broadcloth, and set with scutcheons of buckram in fine gold. Within the said frame of the hearse, the ground was also covered with black cotton. Without the said hearse, round about, went a rail 4 foot and more from the said hearse, the which was hanged with black velvet on the outer side, and on the inner side with fine broadcloth. On the midst of the said rail, against the high altar, was made a small altar, which was covered with velvet and richly garnished with plate. Between the hearse and the said rail, the ground was covered with broadcloth, where there was set 15 stools covered with fine broadcloth, and at every stool a cushion of purple velvet and a cushion of black velvet. Without that rail was a rail, which was made for keeping forth of the people, which was hanged also with black. Ground between the 2 rails was also covered with black cotton, all the which was had and reserved by the officers of arms.
And the steps to the high altar of a great height was hanged with black cloth and garnished with scutcheons, and the high altar richly garnished with ornaments of the church. Also the way from the hearse to the chapel, where the said noble queen was buried, was also hanged with black and garnished with scutcheons, and the said chapel was hanged and garnished with scutcheons in metal. The church with the chancel, the hearse, and chapel thus furnished, the corse was received at the west door in this manner.
At the west door, the corpse was taken out of the chariot and borne by 12 gentlemen. And at the said door of the church stood the Bishop of Winchester and the Bishop of London and the Bishop of Worcester, who censed the corpse and cast holy water on the same. After that, the corpse was brought up to the hearse and set under the same. Then the mourners were placed, the chief at the head and on each side 7. The other noblemen and the executors and overseers with all the standards and banners were placed and said in order. Then,
of your charity, pray for the soul of the most puissant and excellent Princess Mary, by the grace of God, late Queen of England, Spain, France, both the Sicilies, Jerusalem and Ireland, defender of the faith, Archduchess of Austria, Duchess of Burgundy, Milan and Brabant, Countess of Habsburg, Flanders and Tyrol, and the Pater Noster. This prayer was said at every Kyrie eleison and at Magnificat and Benedictus. Then the dirge began, executed by the aforesaid 3 bishops. The first lesson was read by the Lord Abbot of Westminster, the second by the Bishop of Carlisle, the third by the Bishop of Chester, the fourth by the Bishop of Exeter, the fifth by the Bishop of Coventry and Lichfield, the sixth by the Bishop of Worcester, the seventh by the Bishop of Winchester, the eighth by the Bishop of London, the ninth by the Bishop of York. At Magnificat and Benedictus, 2 of the chief bishops aforesaid censed the course thrice about. Then the dirge was proceeded out to the end, and when the dirge was done, the mourners departed from the church to the Lord Abbot's house, where they had a void of spices and wine, after which they had departed for that night.
In the morning, about 6 of the clock, the mourners met at the said abbot's house, and when they were ready, they went to the Mass of Our Lady, having gentlemen, esquires, knights, the officers of arms, and others before them, and so proceeded to the hearse. And when they were placed, the Mass began, sung by the choir by note, with organs, executed by the Bishop of London, with deacon, subdeacon, and assistant. And at the offering time, the chief mourner, assisted and her train borne, with the other mourners following her, offered and no more, and then returned to the hearse again. Then the Mass proceeded to the end. And when the said Mass was done, Mass of the Holy Ghost began, executed by the Bishop of Winchester, with deacon, subdeacon, and assistants, sung by the choir as aforesaid, and at the offering the said chief mourner offered, as at the other Mass before. When the said Masses were done, then the mourners departed, in the same manner that they came to church, to the said Lord Abbot's house, where there was prepared for them a breakfast. After the which they prepared themselves with all the other noble personages to go to the Mass of Requiem, who went to the same in this manner.
And first all the gentlemen, two and two, their hoods on their shoulders, then squires, then knights, then bannerets, then officers of household, being knights, then chaplains of dignity, then barons, then bishops, then viscounts, then the treasurer and comptroller, then earls, then marquises, then dukes, then the ambassador, Count de Feria, then the assistants of the will, then the executors, then Garter, then the chief mourner, assisted as before, her train borne by the Lady Anne Grey, assisted by the Lord Chamberlain, then the other mourners, two and two, then all other ladies and gentlemen, two, and in this order proceeded to the hearse, where they were placed as at the dirge the night before. The beads were bidden, as at night before. Then the Mass of Requiem began, sung solemnly by the choir. Then came forth the Archbishop of York in pontificabilis, and 4 other bishops in the like manner, 2 as pistoller and gospeller, and 2 as deacon and subdeacon with their assistants. And so the Mass began, and proceeding according to the order of the Church till the offertory, which was done very solemnly, as hereafter shall appear. But we'll just pause there. A lot of stuff to take in there. We finally get some performance text beyond what we can assume of in terms of various masses that we could take in. But we have this prayer said repeatedly at various points of your charity. Pray for the soul of the most puissant and excellent Princess Mary. And that's repeated throughout the ceremony, which sort of leapt out of me because I'm always looking for something performative. But yes, there's an awful lot of... I mean, I feel that there's a run on scutcheons clearly at this time. Someone in a workshop's been just getting as many together. Actually, just for the listeners at home, and what precisely in this context is a scutcheon, or what scutcheon is going to be used here? What is a scutcheon? Someone tell the listeners at home.
It's a shield. So it's a coat of arms.
In this context, what do you think it would actually be?
Well, they say that some of them were her arms, which would be the arms of England, the royal arms. And some were her arms divided per pale. That is, hers on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side, the arms of her husband, Philip, King Philip of England, as he was then.
Where is Philip at the moment?
In the Low Countries, I believe, but he is ably represented by his ambassador, the Count de Feria, who has made an appearance.
Yes.
Finally.
Yes, I tripped over his name. Other thoughts about the actual funeral itself, actually, as we've actually got to the actual funeral proceedings. Who wants to leap in? Johanna.
I have so many more fun things. I will try to keep it professional, but excited. So obviously this funeral plays a massive part in the research that I've done. And I think that moment where you're going to get fired anyway, and so you just go out with a bang, is essentially what the Bishop of Winchester does. He preaches this sermon at the funeral, and you haven't got to it yet.
We haven't reached it yet?
I've just flipped ahead. It doesn't talk about it in the next few pages.
Give it time.
Give it time.
I looked ahead. Didn't say. Well, just save my excitement.
Frankly, I don't mind if you tell us before we get to it.
Yeah,
I think actually with
Go
a text
ahead.
like this, which is somewhat opaque, explicating things before they happen is probably for the better. Tell us about this
I
resignation.
want to know.
Tell us all.
I did flip ahead before I got excited, and I didn't see it. I did look. So essentially, when he gives this sermon, he declares that Mary is a dead lion, and Elizabeth is a live dog. And of course, a lion is so much better than a dog in kind of that hierarchy of animals. And so he essentially gets up and says that, you know, a dog is fine, but it's okay. It's better if a dog barks at dangers to the church. And basically at this point is looking at Elizabeth and is going, you're not protecting the church. Like, what good are you? And so he makes this speech that essentially there are wolves, he calls them, coming out of Germany and Geneva. So you know exactly who he's talking about in kind of the massive reforming names. And so he essentially says then that kind of a live dog who dares to bark at sinners or against sinners and blasphemy and heresy is great, but that Elizabeth essentially isn't going to do those things. And so this is essentially this massive funeral sermon that goes kind of, Mary is great, and you're all like going to hell for what you're about to do. And so he, partly because of this and partly because he refuses to acknowledge Elizabeth as supreme governor of the church, he is effectively stripped of his titles and has his position taken away in the next few years. And so this is one of the first moments where Elizabeth's regime puts their foot down and goes, this is not how we will remember Mary. And I just think this is a fascinating kind of insight into what he says and why, and the consequences that are put on him because of it.
I tell you what, I'll give you the section of text where that happened in a minute. So there's a nice signifier. So do we have, as it were, around this? Do we have again a performative text of what was said? So do we have the text of that particular sermon, or do we just have the account of it? So was it in English or was it in Latin?
Oh, it is in English.
Oh,
it is. Give me a second, I can find this for you. It is the funeral oration, and it's held at the British Library. So it is something that you can take out and look. If anyone's super curious, actually, I've just found the reference. It is in the Sloane manuscripts at the British Library. But it's legible and everything. But it's a beautifully written, like physically a beautifully written sermon. Obviously kind of meant kind of for safekeeping, at least for him, that it's not just, I'm going to generally talk about this and then generally talk about that. It's kind of the entire thing written out, which is, I get excited about.
Oh yeah, more of that. I mean, we are known to go back and go over additional texts for things before. We're currently going through an incredibly lengthy process of the visit of the King of Denmark in 1606, which is running to 4, maybe 5 sessions and counting. It's just taking forever to get through all of the material. So hell, if there's more material, we may come back in the future. Any other thoughts before we go into our final chunk of text? What else do you want to leap in? Any questions or thoughts or confusions? No, everyone is silent. Everyone is eyes down, eager to go forth. So, 27, Melita, if you could read that. Johanna, if you could read 28. Greg 29, Eric 30, Liza 31, and 32. Tom, if you could read 33 and 34. And that should get us to the end. Okay, take it away.
Order of the offering at the Mass of Requiem. First the chief mourner, having before her the officers of the household and the officers of arms with the noblemen, her train borne and assisted, her assistants going with her, went to the altar and offered, the said offering being delivered to her by the Countess of Oxford, having a carpet and a cushion laid for her by a gentleman usher, and after she had offered, she returned to the hearse again, the other mourners following her 2 and 2. When the chief mourner was come to the hearse, when she made obeisance to the course, and having officers of arms before her, went to offer for herself, without train borne or assistant, and returned to the hearse again. Then the Marquis of Winchester and the Earl of Westmoreland offered the coats of arms. Then the Earl of Shrewsbury and the Earl of Derby offered the sword. Then the Earl of Huntingdon and the Viscount Montague offered the target. Then the two firsts, the helm and crest. Then the man of arms, the Lord Sheffield, came in, riding, armed at all pieces saving the head, with a poleaxe in his hand, and lighted at the choir door, and being led from thence to the high altar by two noblemen, offered the said poleaxe, and after went to the vestry, and was there unarmed.
The ladies stood up within the hearse, and the Lady North came forth to the rail at the head, unto whom Garter delivered two palls, who with the officers of arms before her went about the hearse, and at the feet that said lady offered the said palls, the which were received by the foresaid Garter, and laid on the feet of the course across. And when she had so done, she returned to the hearse again. All the baronesses did offer two palls apiece in like manner. All countesses did offer 4 palls apiece in like manner. The chief mourner having the officers of the household and the officers of arms, with the noblemen before her, being assisted by the 2 assistants, her train borne and assisted, received of Garter at the head of the hearse 7 palls, and went about the hearse and offered the same as the first lady did, and were laid on the feet of the course in like manner as aforesaid. Then offered Count de Feria, ambassador for King Philip, Garter going before him. Then the 4 noblemen assistants, then the rest of the mourners 2 and 2, then the executors, then the overseers to the will, then the greatest estates. Then offered all knights, squires, and gentlemen. The offering done, the sermon began, made by the Bishop of Winchester, Dr. White, and after the sermon the mass proceeded to the end. At St. John's Gospel, the banner of arms and the banner of St. George was offered.
Then they came 6 knights and took the presentation with great reverence and bare the same into the vestry. Then the Archbishop of York and other bishops came down and sent the course and the choirs that sang the circumdictorant. Then the mourners departed from the hearse. And the corpse was taken up by them that before bare the same, and was carried to the chapel which was appointed for her burial. And there the aforesaid Archbishop with the other bishops said all the ceremonies. In the meantime, in the saying of their prayers, the 4 gentlemen officers took away the pall, and the corpse was let into the grave, and the Archbishop cast earth on the same. Then came the noblemen, being officers to the grave, and brake their staves over their heads, and cast the same into the grave. As the Lord Treasurer, the Lord Chamberlain, the Treasurer and Comptroller, the Sergeant Porter, and the gentlemen officers their rods, and though they departed again to the other noblemen, and the burial ended, the Archbishop and other bishops did uninvest themselves.
The ceremony of the burial done, as it is aforesaid, of the said noble queen, whose soul God pardon, the noblemen and prelates then there assembled, having with them the officers of arms. They came forth into the face of the people, and Garter, principal king of arms, assisted by 2 bishops, did declare the style of the Queen's Majesty in this manner.
Of the most high, most puissant, and most excellent Princess Elizabeth, by the grace of God, Queen of England, France, and Ireland, defender of the faith, etc. God save Queen Elizabeth.
And 32.
Is that still me or someone else?
Yes, please.
Oh, still me.
You got 2.
Unto the which word all the noblemen holding their hands and caps and the trumpeters standing in the rude loft sounded. And this done, all the estates and others departed to the abbot's house to dinner.
Note, there was no dole given at the church, for that there should be no resort of poor people for the annoyance of the estates. But there was mercy, there was money given by the almoner for all the parishes in London and also in Westminster, and to every church also for saying of dirge and mass. And thus ended the ceremony of the interment of the said Queen Mary, on whose soul Jesus have mercy.
I always like these little notes towards the end of texts. We've had some really fun one recently. I like this one. Well, we've been having some lovely post mass suppers, but we make it clear to the hoi polloi they're not to come around the kitchens just in case they clutter up the place. We're in mourning. Go away. Lots of interesting bits of ceremonial here. The whole detail of the riding in with the poleaxe. That's an interesting little bit. Then we got some palls. Anyone would like to talk about pallbearers and palls, and in this context of what's going on there, and also just breaking staves and throwing them into the grave. Go off and uninvest yourself. Go on, off you go. So yeah, thoughts in the room on any of those and other things, Greg?
Just a quick question. I meant to ask this at the beginning. What form did this text take, Helen? What did you transcribe it from?
Yeah, it's effectively a booklet, but it's the size and shape of most. It's effectively a folio. It's undoubtedly at some time belonged to William Cecil, because it's ended up in state papers. But he collected everything, strayed horse notices, reward offered. He collected, vast quantities of stuff. It may have been a copy made for him of someone else's, or he may have commissioned it to be made, or someone may have written it out for their own interest and sent it to him on the grounds of, you might find this useful when the current queen ends her mortal life. There is absolutely no hint as to who wrote it, who made it, or who copied it. It's a fair copy.
Okay. So, and any thoughts about poleaxes? What's going on there then?
I assume he's the Queen's champion, or was the Queen's champion. I can't think of any other reason for him riding into the abbey and delivering a poleaxe.
I mean, it's very dramatic.
We've had a lot of other arms and armor that are also regalia offered, right? Like the helm and crest, the sword. I'm scrolling back up to see, we've had various other things. And yeah, you're right. The Queen's champion rides in armored completely, except his head, because a man can't cover his head in church, right? Mm-hmm. So, and in any case, there's already a helm and crest on the altar. So yeah, I'm guessing that's the poleaxe he's carried as the Queen's champion. Or some sort of ceremonial polearm that gets carried at the head of processions, possibly like the sword and things like that.
I truly don't know. The only reason I say must have been the Queen's champion is because it makes sense. I've got no knowledge of this.
Yes, it's interesting that they talk about the man of arms, like we all know that a man in full armor has to turn up at a funeral.
Well, I'm requesting. So,
well, it didn't happen last Monday before last.
No, we did have some staves being broken, but we didn't have. Yes. They were just placed rather reverently. They weren't put into the grave.
Yes, they were.
Well, technically they were.
Oh, did I miss that?
They were. No.
Everything was lowered.
We didn't actually see the entombment.
No.
But they were, the Lord Chamberlain's staff. I mean, they didn't get the entire household to break all their staffs.
Over their heads.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. You're out of job, mate.
So is there significance to the bishops uninvesting themselves after the service? Is it simply a standard doffing of the raiment after the service is over, or are they... I mean, their office doesn't come from the monarch, it comes from Rome, right? But
yes, they're still in place. They're still they've got about this bunch have got about what, maximum
6 months
of
to
6
live.
months. Yeah, maximum of 6 months before they hand in their resignation sort of piecemeal.
Yes.
I think it just means that they took their the copes that they would have worn the funeral. I mean, you saw last week the Archbishop had the black vestment that's appropriate for funerals, and I think it just means they went and took that bit off.
So they went into the robing chamber in the cathedral and they just
into the vestry and took that bit off.
As did the man at arms as well, because that's where he got unarmed.
No, he clanked his way to lunch and everyone bought him beer.
He says he went to the vestry and there was unarmed. So
yes, but the thing about the presentation is the effigy, which they call a presentation, we would think of as a representation. It gets taken off to the vestry and then becomes the perquisite, effectively, of the vergers of the abbey, who charge people to come and see all their sovereigns' effigies.
And the effigy,
and you still can.
What you were saying earlier about the effigy being the same shape as people as Mary was, the effigy is wearing her clothes, right? Like, so it has to be the same shape as her.
Yeah, so there was actually quite a discussion when they made the effigy, because obviously no one's really sure where Elizabeth at this point is going to come down on like statues and physical representations in the church. They're not sure where she's going to come down on that's an idol or this is a valid form of prayer and intercession. And so when they make the effigy for Mary, the people who make it are actually terrified that if they make it too like Mary, it's going to be seen as an idol. But if you don't make it similar enough, no one's going to recognize it as Mary. And so it's this kind of up close, you would probably look at it and go, I mean, this is just like generic 40-ish-year-old woman. Like it's not distinct Mary. But when it's seen from the distance at which it was meant to be seen would have been, well, this is Mary. So they kind of balance on this line of it's close enough to be her, but not close enough to be perceived by the Elizabethan regime as an idol to be worshipped in a sense. And it therefore is not a threat to Elizabeth.
What are palls? Who can answer?
Pieces of cloth or material. Similar, we saw the king with the little they didn't call it a pall, but like the little piece that was with the banner. So palls, as far as I understand it, are pieces of material that are offered. There's a long description of Queen Jane Seymour's funeral at which Mary was the chief mourner and she was offering the palls.
Excellent.
And they might very well be made into vestments because they are offerings. So I presume they would then be used by the church for
altar cloths and so forth, presumably like Elizabeth's dress, the altar cloth at Bacton Church.
Yeah.
And of course, yes, just talking of Elizabeth, of course, they do make sure that they do style out the current monarch at the end of proceedings. Just to remind you, just who's in charge now. Trumpeters standing in the Rood's loft sounded, and everyone goes off to dinner, of which the people do not get any scraps. But some kind of remuneration goes to the parishes. So
yes,
it's not
dole would be money. It would be coins rather than spare food.
Yes,
but they're not. I mean, Elizabeth was crowned on the 15th or 16th of January. I forget which. 15th. And it's the Bishop of Carlisle who is not in the first rank of bishops, I wouldn't have said. And,
No one else wants to do it.
well, some of them she wouldn't have. I mean, she apparently refused to shake Bishop Bonner's hand. Some of them she wouldn't have, and others had got sick notes. Really serious sick notes. But I mean, it's a bit of a come down if you have to be crowned by the Bishop of Carlisle.
In your sister's clothes. No.
Oh, come on, sisters, they're borrowing each other's clothing all the time.
Not these sisters.
No.
I can hear Mary rolling.
Well, no, I think it's a really important point that Elizabeth wore her sister's robes, because she was that was legitimizing Mary. She was taking on Mary's throne, and it was passing on. It was accepting that Mary was the forerunner. So I think that was probably quite an important thing for Elizabeth. But just to go back to the dole, I would guess that they were also concerned about the epidemic as well, and therefore they didn't want too many poor people hovering about spreading germs.
Right.
The Bishop of Carlisle didn't have suitable robes, and he had to borrow from the Bishop of London. That's just a passing thought.
Oh, well, we are into the realm of final thoughts as we're approaching extra time. Any final comments, questions? We don't have to come up with all the answers now. Just random firings are perfectly legitimate. Eric, do you have any final thoughts or questions?
I tend to always have questions, but I'm just I was distracted by looking at like the British Library website with the manuscripts. But then I found a different manuscript, which is like has like a sort of by someone else. It's part of the Sloane manuscripts, but it's not the one that you referred to earlier, which is fascinating. It also contains a biography and death of William Cecil and Queen Mary the First. Not all of it, obviously, but parts. So some. Pages, is that what it's called? Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting to see the contrast between the royal entrances that are for everyone, and the funerals that are sort of half public and half not, because it's like there are very specific domains where this happens. As far as I can tell, you've got sort of like the sort of the proclamation of the new monarch. But that has to come at the very, very end of like, I don't know, a month and something of, preparation and prayer and adoration, basically. I mean, there's a part of me going like, what happened to the economy during this? Not economy, but I mean, like, it didn't paralyze the state. That's what I mean.
Well, the little bit at the end where they shout out, mention Queen Elizabeth as part of this ceremony. She was proclaimed right at the off of Mary's death. In fact, I will read it to you brief at the end of the session. So that happened way back on the 15th of November. So yeah, nobody's in any doubt who's in charge.
Yeah, but I mean, like, sort of. This isn't like an entire paralysis of like mourning for a month kind of thing. It's like the kind of it's business as usual until certain specific days of mourning for the public mourning as well as private mourning.
But we didn't have 3 days of news stories about queues, which is a definite plus.
There was no queuing. I mean, for this, they didn't queue. They processed, but there's no queuing. There's no queuing.
True, very true.
Greg, any final thoughts?
I'm glad. Thank you, Helen. I'm glad we did this. It's been fascinating. What a text! Though it's not a theatre piece, it's a heck of a chunk of amazing, fascinating history, especially in the circumstances in which we find ourselves, sadly, in the last few weeks.
Yes, I mean it's got a crossover with our more publicly minded pageantry in the sense, we have these processions. They're very ordered. They are the kind of thing that people do a lot. Knowing your place in the procession is an important thing, and it's a good reminder of that. Liza, any final thoughts?
Yeah, my mind is just running on things like effigies. I think Elizabeth had in her time had a similar tomb effigy that was wearing clothes, and in fact the undergarment, the bodice that she was wearing, is called the Effigy Bodice, and I think it is still extant, and historical costumers use it as a source garment. I don't know whether any of Mary's clothes are still extant, but it would be, and I know that clothing historians and also armor historians get a lot of their details from tomb effigies, the sculptural effigies, which I very much take Johanna's point about the wooden effigy couldn't look too much like Queen Mary, or people might venerate it as they did images of saints, which incidentally were often also given clothes and robes that were the clothes and robes weren't part of the sculpture. They were given by the church and by the parishioners as offerings. And but yeah, sculptural effigies are something else where they strive to be as accurate a representation of the person and their clothing or their armor as possible. And I guess, I don't know, would sculptural effigies for royalty be done, or?
Sorry, you say again?
I'm sure I've seen sculptural effigies for male royalty that are older than this, but so let's see. Mary and Elizabeth both get wooden effigies that get clothed. So who's next? Who after them? Who gets a sculptural effigy?
All of them.
All of them.
Yeah, that's just I don't know when exactly it stops, but monarchs get effigies kind of well into the Stuarts and the switch to the Hanoverians. They stop being wooden at a certain point and start being wax, and are, if you're in Westminster Abbey and are up in the Jubilee galleries, up in the what they call the Triforium, you'll notice that the wooden ones are kind of lying. They're very static. Even picturing clothing on them, they're very static. But the ones of William III and Mary II, for example, are standing up. They're wax, they're human hair, they're fully clothed. Like, they are face to face at eye level standing up, which presumably is how the wooden ones would have been. So they evolve in a sense, but it's more unusual to not have one than it is to have one for a monarch.
Melita.
I was going to say, that's an interesting point. Was the effigy recumbent or standing, Mary's?
Because saints are usually standing up, aren't they?
I had always assumed that Mary's was lying, just because of the language that was used.
It
and also just like
sense, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know though. I do not have a definitive answer, but I've just always pictured it.
But that's, we picture it like that's because how we picture it, but it's not, if you read the text, it's not certainly one way or the other. Although whether a standing one would work under the hearse, I don't know. But I mean, this leads me on to a point I was going to make about processions generally. Part of all of this processing and taking a long time was so that the public could see that the monarch was dead. Particularly after Richard II, Edward II, Henry VI, it was all a bit sort of, where were they? Were they really dead? So it became important that people could see that they were dead. And I had one final thought is, you imagine you're, that there is life after death, and there's Mary, she's watching all this, and then she gets put into the tomb, and everybody goes, and it's silent. How lonely is that?
Tom, any final thoughts?
I was fascinated by the way that it built this sort of masquerade of mourning, because it was arduous, but there seemed, for me anyway, there was a slight towards the end. I don't know if it speeded up, but there was a type of hysteria of this, and with the tensions at court, I can imagine there was real consequence to it. So this masquerade of this tension, this hysteria came through for me.
Johanna, any final thoughts?
Always. I think what really strikes me as someone who's focused the academic career on what happens kind of the minute that she's lowered into the crypt on, I think what really strikes me is that all of this is the show of what is expected for a monarch. And it doesn't at all hint of the fact that Mary's will is not executed as Mary wanted, and that she's not reunited with her mother. She's not buried how she wants to be. She's not given the monument that she wants. I'll leave it there because I could talk about this for ages. But that none of this document hints at what happens when the spotlight is off, and what kind of is done in the shadows, in a sense, by Elizabeth's regime and then by James VI of Scotland and First of England's. I think that if you didn't know what happened next, this seems like a really fitting end, but it's not the end. Kind of in my view, this is the beginning of the afterlife of Mary.
Helen, any final thoughts?
Yeah, well, it was great to hear it read. I mean, my thoughts are all about what they were doing at the same time. About the 23rd of November, Elizabeth arrives in London. And so you can then see her Privy Council, which includes quite a number of the mourners, because she takes over a lot of Mary's Privy Council, and you know what they're dealing with, what they're doing, who they're writing to, what precautions they're taking, and there is an enormous subtext going on here. I mean, the poor old Abbot of Westminster he knows his tenure is over. In fact, the monastery of Westminster with its abbey, the abbey is going to be taken back into the state and cease to be because Mary it's one of the few abbeys that she actually put back with a community of monks. And there he is, doling out hospitality. But it's all going to come to an unhappy end. But practically everybody who was there in the clergy, especially, of course, Dr. White.
And him, well, I mean, after a sermon like that, what do you expect? It was probably doomed anyway. Well, all that remains then is, of course, to just remind ourselves that, yes, one queen is dead, but another immediately became queen. So to close the session and say goodbye, here is the proclamation for Elizabeth on the 17th of November, 1558. 8. Elizabeth, by the grace of God, Queen of England, France, and Ireland, defender of the faith, because it hath pleased Almighty God, by calling to his mercy out of this mortal life, to our great grief, our dearest sister of noble memory, Mary, late Queen of England, France, and Ireland, whose soul God have, to dispose and bestow upon us, as the only right heir by blood and lawful succession, the crown and the foresaid kingdoms of England, France, and Ireland, with all manner titles and rights thereunto in any wise appertaining. We do publish and give knowledge by this our proclamation to all manner of people, being natural subjects of every the said kingdoms, that from the beginning of the 17th day of this month of November, at which time our said dearest sister departed from this mortal life, they be discharged of all bonds and duties of subjection towards our said sister, and be from the same time in nature and law bound only to us, as to their only sovereign lady and queen. Wherewith we do by this our proclamation straitly charge and ally them to us, promising on our part no less love and care towards their preservation than hath been in any of our progenitors, and not doubting on their part but they will observe the duty which belongeth to natural, good, and true loving subjects. And further we straitly charge and command all manner our said subjects of every degree to keep themselves in our peace, and not attempt upon any pretence the breach, alteration, or change of any order or usage presently established within this our realm, upon pain of our indignation and the perils and punishment which thereunto in any ways may belong. God save the Queen. Goodbye.